Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to another half hour with Dr. Eiler. As always, if you have questions through the process or through the presentation, just use the chat feature to post them, and Dr. Eiler will address those questions at the end of his presentation. Thank you, Dr. Eiler.
I want to thank Chabin Concepts and Kaiser Martha for continuing to sponsor this and be a part of this series of discussions with y'all. As Vicki said, please put your comments in the chat if you have any, or any questions you may have. We're going to try to leave some time at the end to address some things if you have some questions you want addressed. So what I usually start with is to say we're not in recession, and there are no forecasts out there that suggest that there's 100% probability we'll be in recession. One of the main reasons why we're not declaring recession yet in the United States is because the labor market continues to show growth. So on Friday, the data came out for the US in terms of the labor market and its continued growth in terms of job creation. This blue line represents the recovery period it took for the Great Recession, where we're at 100 in November 2007. It took 78 months to get back to that same number of employees in the aggregate in the United States. And this is what it's looked like in terms of the pandemic, the shock, which you can see that quick cut, and then the slow, steady movement back up past the red dotted line, which is recovery in seasonally adjusted terms of the number of employees in the United States. And now we're 2.6% above the January 2020 numbers. So one of the reasons why I show this is because it tells us why we haven't declared recession yet. Usually recessions are declared when there's a labor market contraction. We have not seen that second contraction yet. But the Federal Reserve, when it's thinking about what it's going to do with interest rates, it's watching the labor market closely, because its supposition is that by the interest rate hikes we've seen, it should reduce the demand for labor, which then reduces incomes, which then reduces spending, which then reduces inflation, which is its ultimate goal. But it knows there's a trade-off in the labor market in terms of that's the opportunity cost of reducing inflation is job loss. And those job losses have not shown up yet in the aggregate. But then that brings us to prices. So inflation has been the focus of an enormous amount of energy for economists, financial gurus, people who comment in the business news about what's going on in the economy. And of all the price indices that are out there, the one that the Federal Reserve looks at, and thus the one that most professional economists like myself think about, is what's called core personal consumption expenditures prices. And what that means is if you take a shopping cart full of everything you buy, not a sampling, which is the CPI, but everything you buy at home, and you think about what's the cost of that shopping cart from last year on a percentage basis in terms of increase or decrease, that April 4.7 is 4.7% higher than last April in terms of the cost of that shopping cart. But we create what's called a core shopping cart when we pull food and energy goods and services out of the shopping cart. So the reason why we tend to look at core is because we're concerned as economists that food and energy prices tend to be very volatile based on harvests, geopolitical issues, a refinery having a fire or something weird like that. And so we think there's so much volatility there. We don't want to create policy change as a result of something that might be short-lived. So we're still sticking with core, regardless of how crazy food and energy prices have now been for a few years. And there's counter arguments all over the place. But for right now, the Federal Reserve is looking at this price index. So the blue solid line are the actual data on a monthly basis since January 2007. And you can see for most of that period, it wobbled underneath that blue dotted line, which is where the Federal Reserve kind of wants to weave the blue solid line around with the idea the blue dotted line is expectations, and the blue solid line is the actual data. So we want to get that blue solid line weaving around the blue dotted line, which means everybody kind of understands that 2% inflation is kind of the goal. Now, with that in mind, the red dots, which you're now going to see shaded, is the current expectations of where prices are going to go over the next few years. So the Federal Reserve believes by what it's done already and what it maybe intends to do, it will continue to force that blue solid line through those red dots. And if it gets there, then it basically will have achieved its mission of taming the recent craziness in inflation, which you can see through the spike in that blue solid line. So what are economists watching in terms of looking forward? Well, one of the things that price expectations, or let's say current inflation feeding the viewpoint on future expectations might do is change the way we think about how long-term and short-term interest rates play off of each other. So that leads to a lot of things that happen in lending markets with respect to banks and credit unions thinking about how much money they want to put at risk, which then can change housing prices. So we're watching those two things play off of each other, and we have to assume housing prices are going to slip back, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. What kind of pressure does this put on wages? There's been some recent research out of the Federal Reserve that suggests that wages are not really being either driven or driving the current inflation cycle, but common sense suggests that, look, if what it cost me at the grocery store is more than it cost me last year by 5%, I'm going to be thinking, well, what's going on with my income, and is it keeping up with what it's costing me at the grocery store? So we know in practice, even regardless of the recent research, that people are going to be thinking about inflation in terms of what they need to be paid. And we've certainly seen wages increase, especially across California. And then we're watching those employment levels. So like I said before, if the Federal Reserve is successful in forcing that blue solid line through those red dots, which is its current goal structure, because now instead of trying to generate what we think of as maximum employment as 1/2 of its congressional mandate, it's now going the other way and trying to create price stability. Those are the two things that the Federal Reserve in the United States, and that's not necessarily the same all around the world, but for our central bank, is to get those two in balance with each other. We need to get that blue solid line through those red dots. At least that's the current stance. What that means is we're going to lose some jobs. Now, how much we're going to lose and how much we need to lose are kind of the big questions of the hour, but watch for local employment levels. If you start to see some wobbliness in your local employment situation, meaning that unemployment's kicked up a little bit or job growth is falling a little bit, which I'll show you in California in some of the metro areas around California in just a minute, those are some things to say, okay, now I'm seeing the policy work. We're assuming that we're going to have that move down, the inflation have a little bit slower growth. And that's the Fed rhetoric right now. They don't intend to increase interest rates again until they see either that blue line kick up with more force or jobs lost with more force. And at the end of the day, they're actually talking about it lowering interest rates either later this year or early next, assuming all those things walk hand in hand. So one of the biggest questions of the hour, though, about inflation is, can we get back down to that blue dotted line? We will see. If we don't, that leads to a lot of other stuff in the macroeconomy. And two things I'll point out here is, one, it provides less stability to interest rates, thus less stability in equity and housing markets, but it also can change the way wage contracts are negotiated, and it leads to less predictability in labor markets. So, and those are tied to each other naturally through the movement of inflation. I'm going to talk about this briefly because we do have a debt deal, but one of the reasons why we had such craziness around the debt the last few weeks is because of these data. The Congressional Budget Office in February released its projections forward through the next 10 years. And this is in an inverse scale, the movement of how much money we spend as a government in the United States at the national level over what we bring in tax revenue, or the so-called fiscal deficit. You can see that spiked during the COVID time when we were basically doing a huge tax return back to households, and has flattened out again. So if you think about that as kind of a pandemic anomaly, that big spike in the middle, the supposition is we're going to kind of moderate a little bit over the next few years toward the middle of the decade and then move forward. So these data are actuals through the end of 2022 and then forecasted through the end of 2033. But you can see it's lifting up. And part of that lift off toward the right-hand side of the graph is because of the recent legislation passed under the Biden administration to do things like the Inflation Reduction Act or the CHIPS Act, and kind of, in a sense, invest in the domestic economy. And some of that's going to cost some money in terms of spending more than we're going to bring in taxes. And the Republicans have been concerned about that, and really concerned about this, which is the evolution of total nominal debt, which is the right-hand axis in black. You can see that that's going to slowly rise. It went up real fast during the pandemic time, but looks like it's going to go even faster. And that's going to happen for two reasons. One, the red line is going to start to kick up toward the end of the 2020s and into the early 2030s, but we're also seeing interest rates rise, which means that it costs the government more to finance that red solid line as we move forward in time. Well, one of the things is that, what do the political events mean for, let's say, our US Treasury securities looking forward? So we know that we've now got the deal done, and there's been some changes in terms of what the total budget package is going to look like, and also some restrictions on getting the federal budget done. But what does that really mean in terms of the macroeconomy? And there's a lot of concerns. In fact, it'll make for a destabilization of interest rates rather than something that's more predictable. And so some of the lingering effects of what we've seen, even though we did get a deal done, is what we see financial markets become very nervous if we look like we're going to have another debt ceiling debate. Does that mean interest rates are going to be more volatile than they need to be? our businesses and households going to start thinking, wow, if they're going to start debating over the debt again, what's that mean for me at home? And what do I need to do with my portfolio or my home or the way I look at my job? And then what's that mean in terms of linking changes in Congress and changing in the White House to the way we're going to look at economic cycles now? And that's kind of probably in priority order descending, but we're going to be thinking that a lot more than we were, let's say, a year ago, because what we don't want to see is every time the debt ceiling gets to another point where there needs to be a decision, there's a huge amount of political volatility around it. We historically do not do well economically when that volatility kicks in. So watch for all that to come. Oh, and one more thing is that peaks at about 118% of GDP. So again, this is what really got the Republicans nervous about where we were going and the ability to use that debt ceiling as a way of renegotiating what was going on. Here's the latest forecast. So as I started with right off the top, we do not have a forecast right now of 100% guaranteed recession. And that's because the way recession works is that there's a group in Boston at what's called the National Bureau of Economic Research that basically makes that decision by squishing together a bunch of data and saying, okay, because these data are now moving in a certain direction, we're going to declare a recession. And there is no formula that says this is recession. There is technical recession when we have 2 quarters in a row of real GDP reductions, meaning there's negative growth 2 quarters in a row of the first shaded area I'm going to show you here now. But that's on an annualized basis. We don't have any negative numbers here, and we're not seeing, again, the conditions under which that would be the beginning of the discussion of going into recession. So over the next couple of years, slower growth or basically about the same growth as predicted from 1 quarter ago. That shaded area is the latest forecast as of May 2023 from 40 forecasters at the Philadelphia Federal Reserve. Interviews every quarter to ask, well, what are your predictions about, let's say, a bunch of different economic variables? I pull out 3 variables that I think are the most focal in terms of what people should be watching. That first shaded area is the growth after inflation of incomes in the United States on an annualized basis, a little slower than the previous quarter for the next 2 years. Oh, sorry, yes, for the next 2 years, then a little faster in 2025 and a little faster in 2026, but the clouds get very, very thick after about 2.5 years of thinking forward in terms of economic forecasting. The key is that we're not seeing negative numbers. Now, with that said, at 1.0, we're very vulnerable as an economy, and we know we have a lot of vulnerability right now. So watch for that as we move forward in time. The unemployment rate, again, this is the reason we haven't declared recession. As much as it's lifting off or maybe increasing a little bit in these forecasters' minds, we're not surging to, let's say, 5, 6, 7% unemployment. Part of that's because the jobs demand that's out there is still pretty hot in the sense that employers still want to hire. A lot of that's the shadow effect of the pandemic. But we may actually have a labor force problem in the sense that if we have a bunch of people now who have left the labor force during the pandemic and are not coming back, we're not really seeing a mass migration back into the labor force. And that suggests that the unemployment rate is not going to surge either, meaning that there's suddenly a bunch of people who come back in looking for work, the jobs are not there, and that the volume of the unemployed starts to swell in such a way that we see those effects in the macroeconomy. None of that's predicted over the next few years. And these are historically low numbers. We're very used to these numbers, but in the long view, still very, very, very strong labor market looking forward. And then there's those same dots, the red dots we saw in the core PCE inflation graph, they're just restated here. Those are basically the same numbers. So slowly sliding inflation, but with the little nuance I didn't talk about when I talked about inflation before, those numbers suggest we are not going to get out of the woods on inflation before probably 2025. That's still going to be some pain between now and then. So looking forward, this year slower, probably next year slower. You can see that in that first shaded area, but we have to imagine that those kind of outcomes come with fighting inflation, higher interest rates, and we're going to see some job losses. So all that together, if it's managed well, we will avoid what you can think of as a long-term economic slowdown, but we're still going to pay some prices for what we in fact saw as fiscal and monetary policy changes during the pandemic that are now slowly being reversed, recognizing that inflation was a little higher than expected. Let's look at California. So this is the movement, kind of the same thing we saw in the original graph in the sense it's the same timeline. January 2020, seasonally adjusted, total number of workers in California. You can see that same kind of shock initially, slow climb up toward that red dotted line, didn't quite get there and have been flat basically over the last about 8 or 9 months. So only created about 24,000 new jobs in the last 8 months in California versus almost 3 million jobs in terms of recovery from the bottom of the pandemic shock, which was May 2020, up to about June, July 2022. So that flattening is in essence a one way of viewing, well, if interest rates started to really go up in early 2022, was California on the front end of feeling those effects? No doubt about it, especially our larger tech employers started to shed jobs in late summer and early fall, and this has continued throughout the first part of 2023. Those are some of the effects in terms of the mixed bag of changes in the labor market. But part of it's also because of labor force in the sense that it's been harder and harder for California businesses to find workers. And so you can see that that blue line, which is the total number of people available for work or currently working in California, sharp fall, then the sort of wobbly period where not much was happening and still under where we were in January 2020 after seasonal adjustment. So the total number of people who see themselves as being available for work or currently working in terms of payroll employment has not come back yet to its original level right before the pandemic seized up the economy. So we're watching that closely in the sense that we need that blue line to keep going up so it provides enough available workers to satiate employer demands. If we look at a forecast going forward, these are the last 3 recessions. I want to show you this in the long view. So for California, in May, when the governor's budget revised came out, the Department of Finance provided a revised look at employment over the next few years. And you can see that evolution from 2000 on a quarterly basis, you can easily see the recessions. You can see when those cycles started to tip down, we went into the gray shaded areas. Obviously, the pandemic had its own nuance to it, but we saw the shock there. You can see, though, that over this shaded area, which is the forecast period, that we're going to maybe flatten out a little bit in 2023 and then start curling up again after 2024. In essence, the same forecast we saw for the US economy, though a little bit slower. So we're not seeing, let's say, a continued flattening like we just saw in the last graph, maybe after this year, but it's going to grow at a slower pace. If you just look at the gradient of that shaded area and the black line within it, and you look at where we were, let's say from 2011 up to 2019, the slope of that line is much steeper in the last decade than we expected this decade. And folks, at the far end of that green area, we're 3 years away from the end of the decade. So this is going to be in some ways almost like a lost decade, which makes some sense in terms of labor markets. We had major labor force shifts. We had a shock that was unprecedented, and we have to expect some cost for that in the medium term. And now we're starting to see it. If we look at the evolution of certain industries since the pandemic, I'm going to move relatively quickly through this to the end of April. What these columns are a monthly change. And let me just take us to the end of 2021. And then I'll move us through into early 2023 relatively quickly after that. You can see the pandemic shock in the first couple of months, April and May, which are the blue and sort of orangish line or orange columns there. And then the slow creep back up toward the red dotted line was where we started on a seasonally adjusted basis right before the pandemic. Well, by the end of 2021, we'd seen a couple of industries, tech and transportation and warehousing and business and professional services really recover in California. But then through the end of 2022 and into 2023, and now we're here in April 2023 with the latest data, total non-farm jobs have recovered. If you look at farm jobs, they've recovered also just a little bit in California, but most of the economy is outside of agriculture in terms of in the field agriculture. You can see transportation warehousing way up, which totally is expected. But then you're starting to see on those other sides, yes, they did recover. So tech, which is information, business professional services, think legal, accounting, architecture, engineering, et cetera. Private schools and healthcare, primarily healthcare in terms of growth here, have all grown from before the pandemic. But we still have a bunch of industries that haven't quite got there yet. And furthermore, what we're concerned about in California is the growth of those industries we expected to grow in the first place. Tech, healthcare, professional services have all kind of slowed a little bit from their original peaks in terms of recovery. So we're watching closely to see if there's any, let's say, business adjustments, or if we're going to go into a slower period, which industries are most vulnerable to kind of going back down toward where we were before the pandemic. And then that takes us back up to what I just said before. One of the biggest things we're concerned about is having kind of a lost decade, isn't though we have, like, let's say, these medium-term shifts in the number of people hired in certain industries. are the certain industries that, yes, they will recover, but they will just barely recover. And before we know it, we're going to be 5 or 6 years away from the pandemic without an enormous amount of growth in California's economy. And that's unfortunately a picture that's starting to slowly show its face. A lot of that because we lost so many jobs in the pandemic. And now with higher interest rates and higher inflation, the amount of hiring and the way that people are looking at their jobs in terms of their wages, let's come back to that wage debate, is starting to slow down a little bit in terms of what people are willing to do for work. If we look at the MSA level, this is growth last year. So in 2022, or since last year, I'm sorry, so this is since April 2022 in terms of seasonally adjusted changes. You can see almost every single major metro area that the California EDD and really the Bureau of Labor Statistics in Washington, D.C. follow in California, growth across the board. And in some places that really had not been growing originally, which I'm now going to show you, that there's some of these places that have not actually recovered yet. So let me walk us back one step. This is from April 2022, growth across the board. This is growth since January 2020. So if you look at the bottom, Sonoma, Solano, Alameda, and Contra Costa, which are basically in the same so-called metro area, Napa County, Santa Cruz County, Butte County, Marin County, have still not recovered the total number of non-farm jobs that they started with in January 2020 in terms of total workers in that area. These other areas, there's a bunch of slow growers too, like below 1% growth. If you look at all those places, even though there was growth last year, we still have room to go before we get back those total number of workers. And that means that some of those areas are not as productive as they were previously. And some of that is because the populations have changed. Now you look at the very top, San Joaquin County, Tulare County, the amalgam of Yuba and Sutter counties have shown really nice growth throughout. Most of those, let's say top 10 are Central Valley. And a lot of the Central Valley has been growing basically consistently since the end of 2020, and that's now showing its face. So those job markets have been very, very robust and remain so. Now let's look at housing briefly. This is the 3-year run in median home price growth as of April 2023. So you can see Kern County at about 38% growth. California on average actually 30% growth, which is pretty good. Not historically good, but good. You can see San Francisco is actually a little negative there, but otherwise, pretty decent growth over 3 years, though let's say Mendocino County has slipped a little bit in terms of its neighbors. This is what it's looked like since the peak. And for most of these counties, the peak was either June, July, or August 2022. So if you've been a regular attendee to these webinars, one thing I talked about when interest rates went up in the last webinar was that we'd probably see about a 10 to 15% change in housing prices. And we're not quite there yet, except for places like Alameda County, San Francisco County, but we're cruising there in some other places. We should expect that to be about the case. And most forecasters are thinking about that as a contraction, but that's from the peak. And we have to be very cautious here to understand how housing markets work. But I know we're getting close on time, so I want to move through this relatively quickly. When you think about housing prices, if I grew by 38% and now I've contracted by 5 or 6% on a compounded basis, that's still pretty good growth in an asset market vis-a-vis what you could have earned some other place. So we have to be a little bit more medium to long view on housing prices, even though we get a stomach ache every time we look at one of those gray columns. We kind of assumed we would have the orange column. So we're going to see how people's decision making is over the summer here in terms of putting their houses up and trying to take the profits while they're still on the table in the homeowner's mind. But we've had some really robust growth, and higher interest rates has not necessarily eroded that growth very quickly yet across the state. This is the current forecast. So the one thing we've seen over the last 3 months is the housing forecast kind of reverse itself. Almost every single county in California, let's say 2 months ago, had a negative forecast, and now it's kind of reversed to a small but positive forecast. So while if we look forward 1 year, so these data are looking from April 2023 to the end of April 2024, most counties slow but positive. So that's good. So the supposition is by these forecasters is that housing markets will kind of reverse the recent trend from peak that's been falling down and actually start creeping back up again sometime in 2024. That's good news. Now it's found that the foundation of that forecast is that we actually are going to see interest rates come back down a little bit and general confidence in the labor market that we're not going to see a major contraction such that people are going to still want to buy homes. However, one of the main reasons why we are not seeing real cuts in prices or real robust growth in prices is that the number of existing units and thus the number of transactions changing these prices is probably going to be pretty slow over the next couple of years. Some of that's price fatigue, some of it's relatively high interest rates, some of it's a lack of construction in terms of net change in the number of housing units available, but it's better than losing. And that's a good thing to see in terms of how those forecasters see in the future. So my last slide in terms of data is looking at the latest population forecast. So if we use 2019 or right before the pandemic as the base of looking forward, this is the evolution of Sacramento County in terms of the current forecast. So maybe about 25% growth through 2050. This is Fresno County to kind of think about, okay, what's the Central Valley going to see? If those labor markets are robust, are people moving there? Then the answer is yes. So these are two core MSAs in terms of where we've seen real strong labor market growth coming out of the pandemic, Sacramento and Fresno. LA and San Diego have different pictures. San Diego, a little bit better mix looking forward to 2050, basically just recovering recent losses or what might be coming because of changing fertility rates and the way that the San Diego area is aging. But Los Angeles losing population. The Bay Area kind of staying more or less flat, but that's because there's been a real mixed bag of what's been happening in the Bay Area, and California slipping over the next 25 years a little more quickly. So if you think about what these population forecasts suggest, it means things like lower high school attendance, of continued labor force issues. We're going to age as a society, but the I-5 corridor, basically think Chico south to, let's say, Bakersfield, is going to be probably where most of the population growth happens in California. And there's going to be more aging on the coastlines, and the Los Angeles metro area is going to be the biggest question mark of them all, especially given recent population change. So we start looking forward. We have an economic slowdown that is going to continue, and it's going to be slow, low, probably not going to have a recession, but the debt politics, what's happening in banking and just general geopolitics around the globe are not going to help. One of the biggest things about economic development, which hopefully will lead to more workforce development, is what's going to happen in renewable energy markets or just in energy markets, wind, solar, hydrogen. There's a lot of places around small suburban and rural California that might be able to take advantage of that. So we're going to see how that evolves over the next few years. And the things I'm watching are watching for housing prices and see how much, let's say, volatility creeps into those markets over the next year or so. Our rural and small suburban downtowns, the more we have economics, the slow movement of the economy continue and relatively high interest rates, how much pressure does that put on our local merchants and our locally owned businesses? Watch for that. Yes, inflation is starting to fade a little bit. We saw that, but it's so slow and it's still at relatively high levels that there's going to be this erosion. And remember, inflation is a regressive tax. Our low to middle income households are more hurt by inflation than anybody else. And finally, we have to remember next year, we got another round of presidential elections, which means there's going to be a lot of focus of businesses on, hey, what's going to happen with the new presidential regime, regardless of who goes in the White House in terms of taxes, in terms of spending, and kind of bringing forward the promise of this other spending on domestic businesses we have through these acts that were spent. How much is the debt change in terms of the debt ceiling deal that was made, change the trajectory of that spending? So medium news, if you want to put it that way. I mean, good, a little bit of bad. We should be able to weave through the next year or so pretty well. Folks, again, thank you so much for attending. I know we have at least one question in the Q&A. Could you explain the data set on the population forecast versus the Department of Finance forecast? They're basically the same. So if the Department of Finance is about 2 years behind right now in terms of its forecast, but it's basically was a similar outlook in that the California population is going to fade over time, maybe not the same speed that Caltrans is seeing when it thinks about transportation, but they're both kind of walking hand in hand and seeing the coastal population fade faster than, let's say, the I-5 corridor population. Aaron, thanks so much for that question. So folks, I do not see any other questions in the chat or in the Q&A. I got a new one here. The statutory COLA this year is 8.22%, and the governor proposes funding this. Yeah, so the idea is that they want to pick up that pace and sort of bring people up to speed with the idea that you're going to have sort of 2 years compounded on that. So Joe, I'm sorry, I'm going to actually go ahead and unmute you if that's okay, because I think that there's more nuance to your question than you're asking in text. Go ahead, Joe.
Thank you. Basically, the idea, I couldn't get typed fast enough.
That's okay.
With the governor proposing such a large COLA compared to core inflation,
Yeah.
and compounding effect over time, how does that, with the state budget uncertainty, I don't know, just comment on that, I guess.
No, absolutely. So the supposition is we're going to have a little faster pace of price growth in California. I think the governor is trying to be pro-worker with that proposal and seeing forward that if that gets more juice now, it will cover especially our lower to middle income households in the next year or so. I think part of it's politics, part of it is economic reality that the prices in California are faster than the national numbers we saw earlier. So I think that both of those things are at work. But it's intriguing to think about paying something forward before and that puts a lot more pressure on our public and private employers one way or the other. So it's intriguing that proposal did come forward. We'll see how much it plays out in the end. Thanks, Joe. Folks, we're out of time. Thank you so much. And again, I want to thank Chabin Concepts for continuing to sponsor this. Have a great summer, and we will be back soon. Take care.